She grew up in the most watched house in the world. She sang on the biggest stages in the country. She raised 4 sons, wrote 25 novels, and built a life that looked from the outside like the American dream made real. And yet, she died alone in a Chicago care facility attached to a respirator in a city she had only just moved to. She was 83 years old. Most people who remembered her name thought of her as a footnote, the president's daughter, the one whose father threatened a music critic. There was so much more to her than that, the girl from Independence. Margaret Truman was born on February 17, 1924, in a house on Delaware Street in Independence, Missouri. Her father, Harry Truman, was a county judge at the time. Not a prominent man, not a man whose name anyone outside of Missouri would have had particular reason to know. Her mother, Bess Wallace Truman, was reserved, proud, and deeply rooted in the particular world of small-town Missouri respectability that she would never fully leave behind, even after the world came to know her name. The Trumans lived in the house that Bess's family had built. It was a Victorian house on a quiet street, and the family who occupied it was a quiet family, not poor, not wealthy, not connected to power in any meaningful national sense. Harry played the piano. Bess kept the household in order, and Margaret, their only child, grew up at the center of a family that was, in its daily texture, unremarkable, which is to say, normal, warm, anchored. She was an only child, which shaped everything. Harry Truman was, by his own admission, inclined to spoil her. He was a father who doted, who wrote her long letters, who sat at the upright piano in the family home and played while she stood beside him and sang. The warmth between them was real and thoroughly documented, and it set the emotional baseline of her life in a way she never fully outgrew. She was her father's daughter, in a way that is rare even in close families. When he was happy, she understood it. When he was burdened, she felt it. When the world came for him, as it eventually enormously did, she took it personally in a way that never fully left her. Her mother was the disciplinarian of the two, more guarded, less effusive, but no less devoted in her own way. Bess Truman was a woman who had grown up understanding that privacy was a form of protection. And she raised Margaret with that same instinct. Don't let them see too much. Don't give them more than they need. Keep the important things inside. It was a philosophy that served a family in small-town Missouri and would prove both useful and limiting when the family moved onto the largest public stage in the country. In 1934, when Margaret was 10 years old, her father won election to the United States Senate. The family's life shifted immediately and permanently. Margaret now spent half the year in public school in Independence and half in Gunston Hall, a private school for girls in Washington, D.C. She was a senator's daughter, which was notable enough. She became a member of DOS, Daughters of the Senators, and began accumulating the particular social education that comes with living in the orbit of power without holding it yourself. She learned the geography of Washington, explored the Smithsonian Museum with an enthusiasm that impressed her classmates, and made friends in a city that was itself learning year by year how consequential it was becoming. She graduated from Gunston Hall in 1942 and enrolled at George Washington University studying history. She christened the battleship USS Missouri at the Brooklyn Navy Yard on January 29, 1944. Her father was by then vice president, nominated on the ticket with Franklin Roosevelt, and the ceremony carried the weight of the moment. She was 19 years old, gracious and composed in front of the cameras, already fluent in the particular performance that public life requires. By the time she was a junior at George Washington, the shape of the world was fracturing under the weight of a war that would define her generation. Her father had become vice president. And then on April 12, 1945, everything changed. Franklin Delano Roosevelt died at Warm Springs, Georgia. Harry S. Truman, county judge from Independence, Missouri, piano player, devoted father, was now the President of the United States. Margaret was 21 years old, still a student, and in a single afternoon, her life became something else entirely. inside the White House. The transition was immediate and total. There was no gradual adjustment, no slow accumulation of attention. One day, Margaret Truman was a college junior with a father who happened to be vice president. The next day, she was the only child of the most powerful man in the world, and every reporter in the country wanted to know what she looked like, what she thought, and what she planned to do with herself. The White House in 1945 was, in many ways, an institution still adjusting to the idea of having a young, unmarried daughter of the president living within its walls. Eleanor Roosevelt's children had been grown and scattered during the years Franklin had occupied the presidency. Before that, you had to go back quite a ways to find a president's only child navigating Washington's social and political landscape without the buffer of siblings or a family structure that could absorb some of the attention. Margaret was alone in a particular way. She had no brothers or sisters to share the scrutiny with. She had her parents, Harry, the president, and Bess, who deeply resented Washington and made no secret of it privately, who had not wanted this life and managed it with steely composure because she had no other choice. Margaret understood both of them. She stood between them, publicly and privately, as she always had. She handled the transition with a composure that surprised people who hadn't been paying close attention to who she was. She was 21, old enough to understand the stakes, young enough to still be genuinely startled by the scale of it. She muted her public commentary and made sure what she said and how she appeared was politically thoughtful. She attended the events required of her. She stood beside her parents at the ceremonies that defined those years. The end of the war in Europe, the surrender of Japan, the beginning of the post-war world that her father was being asked to shape without quite having been prepared for it. She had absorbed enough of her mother's instincts to know that the wrong word in the wrong room becomes a headline by morning. But she was not Bess. She was warmer, more social, more genuinely curious about the people she encountered. She enjoyed meeting the figures who moved through those rooms, diplomats, generals, artists, journalists. She was good at it. She was, in the particular social language of Washington, a natural. But there was one thing she would not give up. Not for the cameras, not for the political optics, not for anyone. She wanted to sing. Margaret had been taking voice lessons since she was 16, starting in Independence with a family friend named Mrs. Thomas J. Strickler. She was a collar soprano, a high, agile voice suited to the most demanding classical repertoire. She had the kind of vocal flexibility that requires years of disciplined training, and she had put in those years. She was serious about it in a way that went beyond the casual musical interest that the daughter of a piano-playing president might be expected to display. She intended to make it a career. That she was now the president's daughter complicated things in ways she understood intellectually, but could not fully protect herself from emotionally. She studied in New York with Estelle Liebling, the voice teacher of soprano Beverly Sills. A meaningful credential, a sign that the circles she was moving in musically were genuine ones. The training was serious. The ambition was real. In March 1947, she made her professional debut, a radio concert with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra broadcast nationally while her parents listened from the Little White House in Key West, Florida. The broadcast reached households across the country. That August, she made her stage debut at the Hollywood Bowl before a crowd of approximately 20 Waldauslauern people. She then embarked on a national concert tour covering some 30 cities. Audiences loved her. She was warm on stage, genuinely present, and carried herself with an unaffected Midwestern ease that audiences in packed concert halls found refreshing. The reviews from this period were largely kind, sometimes genuinely complimentary, sometimes hedging in a polite direction, sometimes faintly equivocal in ways that a careful reader might notice. But the most honest observers, then and later, would acknowledge that there was a question underneath all of it. How much of the warmth in those reviews was for the voice, and how much was for the fact that criticizing the president's daughter carried risks that most critics simply were not eager to take on? That question would be answered definitively in December 1950. And the answer would change everything. The letter that echoed. On December 5, 1950, Margaret Truman gave a concert at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. It was a significant occasion. Her parents were in the audience along with British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, who was in Washington for meetings with her father about the Korean War, which had been underway for months. The hall was full of Washington figures. The applause was warm. The following morning, Washington Post music critic Paul Hume published his review. Hume was 34 years old at the time, a well-regarded music scholar who also taught at Georgetown University. He was not a man with a political agenda or a personal grievance. He was a critic doing what critics are supposed to do, offering an honest, professional assessment of a performance. His review acknowledged that Margaret was attractive on stage and that the audience had responded to her warmly. Then it said plainly that she could not sing very well, that she was noticeably off-pitch through much of the performance, that she had not improved over the years he had heard her, and that her technique still fell short of what could reasonably be called professional. It was a fair review by most accounts. It was also the review that most critics before him had declined to write, because most critics before him were not willing to tell the truth about the president's daughter in print. President Truman read it that same morning. He was already under extraordinary stress. The Korean War was escalating badly, and that very day, he had also learned of the sudden death of Charlie Ross, his childhood friend and White House press secretary. He was grieving and exhausted and furious. He sat down and wrote Paul Hume a letter by hand on White House stationery. The letter told Hume that he had just read a lousy review. It described Hume as an 8 ULA man on 4 ULSA pay. It said that if they ever met, Hume would need a new nose and a considerable amount of beefsteak to deal with the resulting black eyes. It was the kind of letter that a father writes, not a president. Harry Truman would later say exactly that in his own defense, that he had written it as a father, not as the commander-in-chief. He was probably right about that, but the distinction in practice was one the country didn't make. The letter was meant to be private. Truman sent it directly to Hume. Hume showed it to a colleague at a rival paper, the Washington News, which published a story about it. The wire services picked it up. It was printed across the country. By the following day, it was international news. Margaret, who was on a concert tour in Nashville when the story broke, told reporters she was absolutely certain her father had not written such a letter. She said that Paul Hume was a fine critic and had a right to write as he pleased. When the White House confirmed that the president had indeed written it, she went quiet. The public reaction was split along lines that revealed something about how the country saw both the presidency and the press in 1950. Many Americans sided with the president, a father defending his daughter, doing what any father would do if he had the power to do it. The letters that came into the White House in the days that followed ran by the accounting that Harry Truman himself tracked, more than 80% in his favor. He held a staff meeting and marched his aides down to the mailroom to prove it. Many others were alarmed by the letter for exactly the same reason, because the president had the power to do it and had used that power. A sitting president in the middle of a war threatening a newspaper critic with physical violence over a performance review. The implications were not trivial. And somewhere in the middle of all of it was Margaret on a concert tour in Nashville, having done nothing wrong, watching the most public conversation about her life happen entirely without her. After that moment, the critical environment around her performances changed. Reviewers felt freer to be honest. The reviews became more mixed. Some were still positive. Some were not. The illusion of a protected critical consensus was gone, and what was left was something closer to the truth. A voice that some audiences genuinely loved, and a career that existed partly on its own merits and partly on the extraordinary circumstances of who her father was. She continued performing through 1956, and then she stopped. The choice she didn't quite make. It would be too simple to say the Hume Review ended Margaret Truman's singing career. It didn't. Not directly, not immediately. She performed for 6 more years after that night at Constitution Hall. She appeared on Ed Sullivan's show. She toured Europe in 1951 and 1952. She made recordings for RCA Victor, one album of classical selections, one of American art songs. In 1951, Time magazine put her on its cover. She performed on stage, radio, and television through 1956. But something had shifted underneath all of it. The question that had always been there, whether the positive reviews were for The Voice or for the father's office, had now been asked out loud by someone credible enough that the question could not be comfortably set aside again. And as Hume had predicted, subsequent critics felt freer to be honest. The reviews became genuinely mixed. Some were still positive, some were not. What had once been a largely protected critical consensus was gone. Margaret kept her own counsel on this. She did not in public speak bitterly about the review or about the critics who followed Hume's lead. She defended Hume's right to write what he believed. She carried herself through all of it with the composure her mother had taught her. But people who watched her closely noticed that something in the confidence of the enterprise had changed. When her father left the White House in January 1953, Margaret moved to New York City. She had signed a contract with NBC in 1951, and she continued working with them, appearing on radio programs, filling in for Edward R. Murrow on his television show Person in 1955, and co-hosting a daily radio program called Weekday, alongside a young Mike Wallace, presenting news and interviews aimed at female audiences. The program was smart and well-regarded. She was building something new, a media presence, a public voice distinct from the soprano voice, and a foothold in New York that had nothing to do with the White House or Missouri or any of it. She was in this period genuinely making herself. In 1955, she met Clifton Daniel. He was working for the New York Times as an assistant to the foreign news editor, a man of considerable professional standing and polish, a North Carolinian who had made himself into an international correspondent and would eventually become the paper's managing editor. They moved in the same social orbit, were introduced through mutual acquaintances, and by early 1956, they were engaged. They married on April 21st, 1956, at Trinity Episcopal Church in Independence, Missouri, back in the town she had come from, in the state that had always been the fixed point of her family's identity. It was a large public wedding. The dress was designed by Italian couturier Nicole Fontana. The guest list included figures from political, journalistic, and social circles across the country. And 1 year after the wedding, the singing stopped. In 1957, Margaret formally stepped away from her concert career. She said later in various interviews across subsequent decades that she had made a choice, that being a wife and mother was itself a career, one she took seriously and respected as much as any professional path. She was sincere in that. The conviction was not performed. But people who followed her story could not help wondering quietly whether the choice had been entirely free, whether the accumulated weight of the Hume Review and its aftermath, of the mixed critical climate that followed, of the particular difficulty of building a sustained artistic reputation when half your audience is looking at you and seeing the president's daughter rather than the soprano, whether all of that had made the decision feel more inevitable than it actually was, whether a different woman in different circumstances might have kept going longer, built something on honest terms without the impossible weight of national attention pressing down on every note. There is no clean answer to that. Margaret herself never offered one. What she did instead was write the writer in the apartment. The Daniels made their home in New York, a Park Avenue apartment that became over the decades the fixed point of their life together. Clifton rose steadily at the New York Times, eventually becoming its managing editor from 1964 to 1969 and later heading its Washington bureau before retiring. Margaret had 4 sons: Clifton Truman, Daniel born in 1957, William Wallace, Daniel born in 1959, Harrison Gates, Daniel born in 1963, and Thomas Washington, Daniel born in 1966. She had, by any conventional measure, built exactly the kind of life that post-war American society held up as the aspirational model for women of her background and generation. She was the wife of a prominent and respected man. She was the mother of 4 sons. She lived in one of the most desirable apartments in one of the most storied cities in the world. She hosted, she attended. She was, as the accounts describe her, a genuine New York socialite, someone who knew how to be in a room, who was valued in social settings for her warmth and her sharpness, and the particular quality of someone who had seen history from the inside and retained the clarity to speak about it without pretension. But she kept writing. She had been prompted initially by self-defense. In the mid-1950s, an unauthorized biography of her life was in the planning stages, and Margaret decided, with the same practical directness that had served her through the White House years, that she would rather tell her own story than have someone else tell it for her. The result was Souvenir, Margaret Truman's own story, published in 1956, the same year she married. Critics received it with genuine warmth, describing it as gracefully written, honest without being sensational. The account of a Midwestern girl drawn into history by circumstances she had not sought and navigated with more composure than most would have managed. She did not publish again for over a decade. The sons were young. The apartment was full. The years passed, the way the years of a full family life tend to pass loudly and quickly in a blur of school schedules and dinners and domestic logistics that leave very little room for the kind of sustained concentration that writing requires. In 1969, she released a book about White House pets that found a warm audience. It was slight compared to what would come next, but it reminded people that she was still there, still thinking, still working, still finding angles on the world she had grown up in. Then, in 1973, she published the project she had been working toward for years, a full biography of her father. Harry S. Truman came out shortly after Harry Truman died in December 1972. The book was critically acclaimed. Reviewers praised its intimacy, its access to the private man behind the public presidency, the particular quality of a portrait that only a daughter who had loved her father unreservedly could have produced. It became a bestseller. It was by most assessments a genuinely good book, not simply an act of filial devotion, but a substantive contribution to the historical record of a presidency. She was 48 years old when it came out. It was in many ways the beginning of the most productive period of her professional life. She wrote about her mother. Next, Bess W. Truman published in 1986. A rare and deeply researched biography of a woman who had spent her public life deliberately maintaining as low a profile as possible, who had resisted Washington throughout, and who left behind fewer traces than almost any other First Lady of the 20th century. It required patience and a kind of investigative persistence to write well, and Margaret brought both. She wrote Women of Courage in 1976. She wrote histories of the White House and books about the first ladies who had inhabited it. She wrote and edited collections of her father's private papers. She built book by book a body of work that was rooted in her own family and her own first-hand knowledge of the institutions she described. And then in 1980, she did something that surprised almost everyone who thought they understood her work. She published a murder mystery. Murder in the White House was the first in what would become the Capital Crimes series. Mystery novels set in the corridors of Washington, in the buildings and institutions and social worlds she had known her whole life. The series ran to 25 novels published almost annually until the end of her life. The last one, Murder on K Street, came out in 2007, the year before she died. Her son, Clifton, once joked that his mother seemed to have a deeply negative opinion of almost everyone in Washington, and that the murder mysteries were how she managed it, killing them off one by one in fiction. It was the kind of joke that the Trumans made, wry, plain-spoken, and carrying more truth than it let on. The series was commercially successful, genuinely popular with readers, and won her an audience that had nothing to do with her father or the White House or the singing career. It was hers fully and finally, whatever questions had attached to her earlier work. Is she a real soprano or the president's daughter? Is this a real biography or an act of loyalty? The mysteries stripped all of that away. Nobody read Murder at the CIA because of Harry Truman. She had found somewhere in her 50s and 60s the work that was entirely her own. And then the losses began. The year everything broke. The year 2000 arrived the way the worst years do, without warning that it was going to be the kind that rearranges everything. On February 21, 2000, Clifton Daniel died at their Park Avenue apartment. He was 87 years old. He had suffered a stroke, his heart having been weakening for some time. They had been married for 44 years. He had been the stable architecture of her adult life. The managing editor who rose to lead one of the most important newspapers in the world. The man who had watched her turn to fiction and told her with evident pride to stick to what she knew. The man who had shared the Park Avenue apartment through the writing of 20-some mystery novels, through the biographies of her parents, through the raising of 4 sons and the watching of grandchildren arrive. 44 years. In a life that had been so publicly and persistently scrutinized, the marriage was one of the things that had remained genuinely private, not because they hid it, but because it was stable, and stability in the tabloid arithmetic of American public life generates very little material. She was 75 years old when he died. She had her sons, she had her work, she had the apartment, and then 6 months later, on September 4, 2000, her son, William Wallace Daniel, was struck by a taxicab on Park Avenue just outside her building and died from his injuries 2 days after the accident. William was 41 years old. He was the second of her 4 sons, a psychiatric social worker and researcher at the New York State Psychiatric Institute at Columbia University, where he worked on reducing risk factors for serious mental illness. He was crossing Park Avenue at East 76th Street at 2:40 in the morning when the cab traveling north struck him. He was taken to New York Hospital. He died there on September 4, 2000. The accident happened a few feet from the building where his mother lived. William had spent his professional life helping people who were suffering in ways most people preferred not to look at directly. He had just lived through his father's death. He was 41 years old. His eldest brother Clifton told a reporter that their mother was devastated, that the 2 losses arriving within 6 months of each other were almost beyond bearing. But he said she had her chin up. That phrase, "she had her chin up," was the kind of thing the Truman said about each other. It was Bess's daughter's grief being described in Bess's language. Keep the important things inside. Don't let them see too much. The chin stays up, not because the weight isn't crushing, but because that is what people in this family do when the weight gets heavy. Margaret kept writing. In the months and years that followed, she published more mystery novels. She kept up her involvement with the Harry S. Truman Library. She answered correspondence. She remained to the outside world recognizably herself, active, engaged, present. But the Park Avenue apartment was a different place now. The man she had shared it with for 44 years was gone. One of the 4 sons she had raised in it was gone. The particular fullness of a life built over decades. The dinners, the editorial conversations, the grandchildren visiting, the steady daily presence of a long marriage had contracted into something smaller and quieter and much harder to fill. She stayed for several more years. She stayed in that apartment, in that city, in the life she had built, and that had been so thoroughly rearranged. She kept her chin up, she kept writing, she kept going, and then finally, she made the decision she had been moving toward for years, the final move. By her early 80s, Margaret Truman was dealing with health problems that had been accumulating for some time. She remained interested in the Truman Library's operations. The library's director noted in 2008 that she had been unable to visit in recent years due to her health, but had stayed actively engaged with its work by other means, making her wishes known from the distance that her condition now required. She continued to write as long as she was able. Her last mystery novel, Murder on K Street, was published in 2007, the year before she died. In May 2007, she made plans to move from New York to Chicago, where her eldest son, Clifton, lived. This was not a small decision. She had lived at the Park Avenue address for 41 years, nearly half her life, and all of the life that had mattered most to her as a private person. The marriage, the sons growing up, the decades of writing, the long grief of 2000 and whatever had followed it. Leaving New York meant leaving the last physical context of the life she had built with Clifton Daniel. It meant acknowledging, without quite needing to say it, that the era she had built around that apartment was over, and that what remained was something quieter. Proximity to a son, medical care, a smaller and more managed version of daily life. The move was delayed by illness and a hospitalization in New York. She was not well enough to manage it on the original timeline. But she eventually made it to Chicago, to a care facility near Clifton. She was on a respirator in the final weeks. She was dealing with a serious infection. She died on January 29, 2008. Her ashes and those of her husband, Clifton Daniel, were interred in Independence, Missouri, on the grounds of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library in her parents' burial plot. She went home to them in the end. Back to the house on Delaware Street. Back to the small city where Harry Truman had been a county judge and Bess Truman had kept the important things inside. And Margaret had grown up not yet knowing what was coming, what she left behind. She left behind 3 surviving sons. She left behind 5 grandchildren. She left behind 25 mystery novels, 2 landmark presidential biographies, a memoir, histories of the White House, and a body of nonfiction work about the women who had lived in it. More than 20 books in total, written across 6 decades, covering more ground than most writers manage in a full career. She left behind the story of a singing career that ended not with a single decisive blow, but with a slow accumulation of pressures from all directions. The scrutiny of being a president's daughter, the Hume Review and the atmosphere it created, the marriage and the sons and the choices that pile up in a life until a person looks back and cannot quite reconstruct the sequence that led to where they ended up. She left behind a set of remarks given in interviews over the years that were more candid than anyone who had met the composed, gracious public figure might have expected. She said she felt she had lived several different lives and that the White House years were one of them. She said that some of it was fun, but most of it was not. She said it had been a great view of history being made. The only thing she had ever missed about the White House, she said, was having a car and driver. That last line is pure Margaret Truman, the Midwestern plainness, the refusal to sentimentalize what had actually been a profoundly strange and difficult thing to live through. She could have built a second career out of warmly remembered anecdotes about her famous father and the great men he had known. Many people in her position would have. Instead, she chose to be honest, and the honesty had a slightly dry edge to it, the edge of someone who had been looked at for a very long time and had made a quiet peace with never being fully seen. She was throughout her life, more than the role that history assigned her. She was not simply the president's daughter. She was not simply the woman whose father threatened a music critic. She was a trained singer who had performed before audiences of 20,000 people at the Hollywood Bowl and in the halls of Washington and New York and across 30 cities on a national tour. She was a journalist who co-hosted a national radio program with Mike Wallace. She was a biographer who produced a critically acclaimed portrait of a presidency that remains part of the historical record. She was a novelist who found her most authentic and commercially successful voice in her 50s in a genre nobody would have predicted for her and who kept writing until the year she died. And she was underneath all of it a woman who had grown up in a quiet house in Independence, Missouri, with a father who played the piano and a mother who kept the important things inside and who had spent her entire adult life trying to figure out how to remain the person that House had made her while living a life that House could not possibly have prepared her for. Harry Truman was by most historical assessments one of the more consequential American presidents of the 20th century. The man who ended World War II, who oversaw the beginning of the Cold War, who made decisions that shaped the world for decades. His name is on a library in Independence and on a college in Chicago where his grandson works. His face is on the covers of history books. Margaret's name is on 25 mystery novels that are still in print and on 2 presidential biographies that historians still reference, and on the gravestone she shares with her husband in her parents' burial plot on the grounds of the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. She went home to them in the end, back to the house on Delaware Street, back to the city where the piano played and the important things stayed inside. Back to the beginning of the story, which had always been, even at its most scrutinized and public and enormous, a private one. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.